going to begin with just a basic idea. This is that the square of any real number is always positive. And we know this. We've seen this before. We know that if I have 2 squared, for instance, that is 4. We also know that if I were to square negative 2 squared, guess what? I still have positive 4. So it doesn't matter if a number is positive or negative. When I square it, it always ends up being positive. And that is true for any number that you can think of. Any, positive 1, negative 1, positive 0.5, negative 0.5, whatever you can think of. Those numbers, when you square them, are always positive. This leads us to a very interesting problem. Because if the square of any real number is always positive, we're not able to take the square root of a negative number. For instance, if I wanted to take the square root of negative 1, here I have x squared equals negative 1, so I would need to take the square root to get x by itself, like we've seen. When we do that, we cannot actually take the square root of negative 1, because there is no number I can multiply by itself to get negative 1. It doesn't exist. So, mathematicians, being the creative bunch that they are, invented the imaginary unit I. Now, it was created so that we can solve quadratic equations like x equals the square root of negative 1. Now, the imaginary unit I is defined as I equals the square root of negative 1. And I squared equals negative 1. So I is the only number that you can square and get a negative. That makes it imaginary. It's not a real number. It's an imaginary number. Now, before we go jumping off into the distance of why we have imaginary numbers and real numbers, the imaginary part of imaginary number doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. All right? Imaginary number I shows up in physics, real-world applications all the time. It's just that since it's not technically a real number, we call it an imaginary number. Just a naming convention. It doesn't mean that I doesn't actually exist. Now, we know the imaginary unit I is the square root of negative 1, or I squared equals negative 1. So let's look at how this actually works. If we want to take the square root of a negative number, here's what happens. If r is a positive real number, then the square root of negative r is equal to I square root of r. So what we've done is removed the negative sign and put I in front instead. So, for instance, square root of negative 3, we take this negative sign here, we remove it from underneath the radical, and it becomes I. When we do that, we get I square root of negative 3. The negative sign is removed, the 3 is left, and I sits out front. Now, using that property, we can expand it just a little bit and look at what would happen if we squared the square root of r squared. If we did that, we would get negative r. And again, here's how. If I squared I square root of r, what I would be doing is squaring the I and getting I squared, and squaring the square root of 3. Now, of course, the square root of 3 squared is 3. And we've seen that before. Well, I squared, by definition, is negative 1. So I squared times 3 is negative 1 times 3. Negative 1 times 3, then, is negative 3. And that's how we get there. So that's just a useful piece of information to have. We have I squared equals negative 1, and we can multiply it together to get negative 1.